Polling shows that Americans actually seem to be growing less empathetic to the transgender cause. But what's behind it? What's going on here? Well, some activists and movement leaders think that it is due to the transgender movement's confrontational and accusatory approach. And I'm not saying that. This lengthy piece published in the New York Times this week really did delve into it. So on social media in particular, some of you might have seen time and time again, like advocates for the cause being pretty aggressive. And look, it comes from a good place. This is just about the tactics, right? They're aggressively going after anyone they see as like stepping out of line, saying anything that might be deemed insensitive toward the trans community. For example, after a Democratic congressman defended parents who expressed concern about transgender athletes competing against their young daughters, a local party official and ally compared him to a Nazi cooperator. Okay, and a group called Neighbors Against Hate organized a protest outside his office. But look, the example that was detailed in this piece that really bothered me is the one I'm about to detail, okay? So last week, as we all know, Nancy Mace, and she's continued it like this week. Like she's engaging in this really disgusting harassment campaign against an incoming transgender member of Congress. First, openly transgender member of Congress to, serve in the House. And her name is Sarah McBride. And just preemptively off the, right after the election where Trump proved to be successful, partly because of airing an ad about Democrats' support for transgender people, you have Nancy Mace try to capitalize on that, try to kind of piggyback off of that. And that's why I believe she's been attacking Sarah McBride pretty aggressively. But you would think the transgender community, or at least the activists, would support Sarah McBride and want to protect her, but that unfortunately has not been the case. In fact, they are saying that she is a voice for her constituents rather than a voice for the transgender movement. And then they accused her of capitulating to the right. She has done no such thing at all. Okay, the fact that now she's getting this kind of hate from activists really upsets me. But look, that kind of strategy also doesn't really seem to be working. It's actually been pretty counterproductive for the transgender community. More than 24 red states now limit access to transition medical treatment. And public opinion is actually trending in the opposite direction that these advocates were pushing for. Fewer Americans today than 2 years ago say they support allowing children to undergo gender transition treatment, according to the Public Religion Research Institute. I will say the Public Religion Research Institute very clearly would have a bias. So I would take their data with some grain of salt. But nonetheless, you kind of see it when it comes to public opinion. So I remember in 2016, when Republicans were trying to make the bathroom issue a big deal, the majority of Americans weren't buying it. The majority of Americans are like, let's just stop harassing transgender people. It's the bathroom. Like there's stalls. Everything's going to be okay. I do think it gets a little tricky though when it comes to other, gender segregated or sex segregated spaces like a women's locker room and all of that. I don't want to get into the details, but like when it comes to the bathroom, most Americans were on the side of allowing transgender people to use the bathroom that they identify with. That's kind of changing now. I'm actually seeing a lot of support toward Nancy Mace and a lot of backlash toward the trans community. A 2024 YouGov poll found that 36% of Americans say societal acceptance of transgender people has gone too far. And that's actually a 7 percentage point increase since 2018. And numbers like that have led to some people rethinking their strategy. So Rodrigo Heng, I don't want to mispronounce his name, but Rodrigo Heng Littinen, who's the executive director of Advocates for Transgender Equality, argues, quote, "We have to make it okay for someone to change their minds. We cannot vilify them for not being on our side. No one wants to join that team." And he says, no one wants to feel stupid or condescended to. Another advocate named Mara Kiesling, who founded the National Center for Transgender Equality back in 2002 remembered an adage that she used 20 years ago about the legislative priorities. You can't say don't fire them until you can say don't kill them, meaning that advocates should focus first on measures that reinforce the fundamental humanity of transgender people, such as hate crime protections. Then, she said, you can push more effectively for laws about discrimination. And she also argues that activists lost credibility with many Americans once they started accusing people of bigotry for having concerns about trans women in high-level sports. We looked unreasonable. We should be talking about the 7-year-old who just wants to play soccer with her friends. And look, this is the critical takeaway from the piece. Advocates say that their research had found that the most effective messaging takes into account that most Americans do not know a lot about life as a transgender person and reinforce the basic idea that transgender people want what everyone else wants: fairness, respect, and love. Now, obviously not everyone agrees, but before we get to that, curious what you think, Was.
It's really interesting. Because I think it's a test case for when a movement, when it comes to LGBTQ, just over time, just like accumulated a lot of wins and felt like a lot of progress. I think it got to the trans stuff, and the messaging and the aims became a little bit more aggressive because there was like, all right, we kind of won all of these victories, right? And I think what we're seeing is a sort of retrenchment from that. I want to say, first of all, just like on this and many issues, like my principles are kind of the same. Like, I don't think you should be able to deny a trans person a job, a way to work, because they're trans. You can't deny them housing because they're trans. You can't deny them healthcare because they're trans. Like, this is just, these are the basic pillars of civil rights, right? However, on an issue like trans people in sports, when basically 70% of the country are like, well, we already separate women and men's sports already. How am I a crazy person for thinking we should just keep it that way, even for trans people? Like, the idea that those people are foaming at the mouth, bigots who want to string trans people up, I just don't think that's an effective message. I think this, I think it just needs to be demonstrated again, more education and just a more willingness to like meet people where they are and not assume every single person you meet is gonna have the views on trans issues as everybody from your freaking liberal arts college. Like, it just doesn't work like that. And again, I say this up here all the time. If you think that 70%, like, you're on the other side of a 70+% issue, if your answer to that is like that 70% of the population are complete crazy scumbag idiots who I need to berate at every turn, you're just going about this all wrong. I will never tire of saying that.
Yeah, and look, let's remember how the gay community won over the hearts and minds of Americans. It took a tremendous amount of patience. It took, like almost like a public education campaign so people could actually familiarize themselves with gay people in this country. But more importantly, they made an effort to like make clear, like, we're not a threat. We're just like everyone else, So I think that the patience is a difficult thing to have. I am an impatient person. And when I feel that I've been wronged or in whatever way discriminated against, whether it's because I'm a woman or whatever reason, you do feel that urge, that instinct to get defensive, to lash out. But you have to kind of think about what the bigger picture is and how this is really a persuasion campaign. And when your first line is to attack the person who isn't fully on board immediately, well, then you've just lost someone who might have actually been receptive if you were willing to just pause for a minute, take a breath if you need to, but come back and try a different way of getting that individual to understand where you're coming from. And that takes a lot of work. It's very difficult. But I do think, look, here's the problem though. This is the problem I had with the piece. And I think this is a problem that the Democratic Party has overall with every social issue. I don't think that the majority of transgender activists or transgender people behave like this. I don't think the majority of them are aggressive or combative. I have a friend who's transgender. She is not like this at all. And in fact, she can't stand that like this is the way, people think of trans activists. It's a small group of very loud people and they get all the attention. And they really need to consider how the movement at large feels about the tactics they're deploying. Because it's not just about making people who aren't on board feel comfortable. It's about winning. And if they're deploying tactics that lead to losing, well, then the movement overall is obviously going to be upset about that. And so I think more patience, more coordination, but also for those who have fallen prey to this ideology that everyone who's trans acts like this or everyone who's a trans activist acts like this, it's just not true. It's a small group of very loud and aggressive people who I think might have their hearts in the right place, but aren't really thinking about how their tactics are counterproductive.
Yeah, I mean, last thing I'll say about this, I remember Ta-Nehisi Coates was in a public spat with Andrew Sullivan about the bell curve, and he was just like, "Look, I'm not gonna." And the bell curve is like pseudo eugenic science about how black people are basically dumber than everybody. And he's like, "Look, I'm not gonna engage with somebody who thinks that black people are naturally dumber than people." That's not what this is. I'm sorry,
Right.
it's just not. Just the idea that the parents like, yeah, that 8-year-old trans kid is gonna kick my kid's ass at basketball. It's just a completely different argument. And I think, there's just gotta be some hand holding, man. Quite frankly, like you gotta be willing to do some hand holding with these folks.
Thanks for watching. If you become a member, you get to watch all this ad-free, except for, of course, this ad. Still, hit the join button below.